G'day team, welcome to the show. This is Roll with the Punches podcast and I'm your host Tiffanee Cook, and if you're a follower of mine and you haven't just landed here accidentally wondering what's going on, if you're a follower of mine and you've seen some socials recently, you have probably already seen and might even be eagerly awaiting this episode with Stephen Jenkinson. It is one of my favourites. I absolutely clung to every word in this conversation. It's deep and philosophical, and it might not sound uplifting, but I think it is. We're talking about death and dying and what it means to die well, and, well, I'm going to get out of the way. Stephen Jenkinson, welcome to Roll with the Punches.
Thank you. You're very chipper for this time of the day. I'm glad you are.
Well, this is the thing. It's not even 11 a.m. yet in my corner of the world.
All right.
So I should be chipper. What time is it there?
I think it's like going on to 8 o'clock or something in the evening.
Yeah. Well, see, I'd be winding down ready for bed if I were you. I'm a nana.
Well, I should be, but I'm here talking to you instead.
Well, I am very grateful. Thank you. Do you want to tell people whereabouts you are? Where in the world?
Sure. Eastern Ontario in Canada, almost on the Ontario-Quebec border, north of one of the Great Lakes, and in the woodlands beside on the banks of a old river that was the only way that Indigenous people got around for the longest time. Yeah, that's wow. Where I am.
Beautiful. Have you always resided there, or have you traveled a little bit?
Always is a very long time frame for an individual human being, but in my case, no. I've owned this farm for about 23 years or something like that, and we just finished putting up an old barn, re-erecting an old barn, 120-year-old barn, which in my corner of the world, as buildings go, that's quite old. So it was a great privilege, and there it looms now, the cathedral of the pre-Iron Age people, from whom I clearly derive.
Oh, I've been quite excited to speak to you. You're an extremely interesting person, and I feel like there's 1,000 conversations I could go into. But when you introduce yourself to people who don't know you, who are you? Who do you tell them you are? And I mean, that's a weird question, isn't it?
It is. It presumes that I do such a thing. And I'm just thinking now, to answer your question in good faith, and I'm not sure that, the way I encounter people is almost uniformly in a public presentation context. Otherwise, if I'm not performing or speaking or whatever it is, if it's at the bank, let's say, I try to keep a low profile because, who needs notoriety 24 hours a day?
So, that's very true.
Yeah. So anybody who's not familiar with the work that I've done is not more familiar with it upon meeting me. I try to keep them quite separate so we could just be, pedestrian about the encounter.
It raises an interesting point that I often think about around identity and how we identify with that which we do, which is always a bit of a vortex. And unfortunately, I realized recently when I finally got to take a little trip away and I went on a cycling tour in Vietnam. And even when I talk about things like this and we have awareness on things, knowledge doesn't always mean anything when it's put into action. And so I landed in Vietnam and realized that despite the self-awareness and despite the actions that I take and despite all the things I think I'm telling myself or knowing in the moment, I realized I was living in this identity of the what I do and the who I am to people, which I didn't realize until I landed in a different country and a different culture with 7 different people that I didn't know doing things I don't normally do. And I was like, oh, whoops, even I'm still doing it.
Yeah. Well, it's understandable to try to take a step back from the manufactured identity scenario, for sure. I find, to be honest, I probably take a slightly different tack on the question at this juncture in my life. And it's this, and I'm extremely lucky to be able to say this, but the work that I do is pretty much indistinguishable from the life I'm lucky enough to live. So I don't actually have to hold my nose, for certain parts of the endeavor, and then try to be some kind of authentic, mythical, authentic self in other circuits. I really find a lot of consistency available to me across the board, between the bank and the, I don't know why the bank's coming in for high rotation right now, but anyway, I have to go tomorrow. That's why I have to go meet the guy tomorrow. No, the performing thing is clearly an artifice. I don't mean that it's false. I just mean it's a construct, and it's more obviously and self-avowedly a construct that allows for a few hours of engagement that way, but people would never tolerate that, obviously, at any other kind of circumstance. So I'm lucky to be able to do it. I can wonder about things in real time without trying to establish acres of conversational context beforehand. I mean, this is a wondrous thing. And, I get to do things like, talking with you here. And I'm deeply appreciative of the continuity that's available to me between farming and touring and writing books and things like that. I don't find that there's a great reach. And more importantly, unless I'm really deluding myself, which I don't think is the case, I'm not torn between, quote, making a living at things that fundamentally harm the world in some way versus keeping things together so that I can do something real and rehabilitative, with whatever that sour work has afforded me. I'm not in that situation. And I'm probably, relatively speaking, not only lucky, but rare that I'm not torn that way, you see. So for me, my obligation is to find a way to be celebratory about that without being glib or self-satisfied.
I love that. I want to read one sentence out of what is written about your book. Now, was that book written in 2015? Am I right there? Dying Well?
Which book are we talking about?
Sorry, Dying Well? Die Well? Die Wise?
No, Die
I'll
Wise.
get it right, yeah. Come on, Tiff.
It was probably written in 2014 and came out 2015.
Right. So I want to read this one sentence and then I would love you to elaborate on it. Dying well is a right and responsibility of everyone. It is a moral, political, and spiritual obligation each person owes their ancestors and their heirs. It is not a lifestyle option. It is a birthright and a debt. Okay, go. Tell me about this.
Rather emphatic, isn't it? I was quite sure of myself at the time, clearly.
Do you still, does that, hearing me read that, does that still hold the same meaning it did when you wrote the book?
More so.
Yeah.
Yeah, more so. Why? Because here's why. The failure to undertake the work that sentence describes has demonstrable, emphatic consequences for the near future, as well as for whatever distant iteration of time you'd like to imagine. But certainly for the near future, our failure to die well when it's our turn, I would say, incubates in those witnesses that gather around that a kind of mortal dread that you can't take back. I mean, clearly you're not here, but beyond that, even if you were, you can't say, just kidding, or you can't say, hey, I was just trying to figure it out at the time. Don't, no big deal. Or don't take me seriously. It's just, I'm just a beginner at these matters. None of these things are available to you. The consequences are grown up, heavily scaled consequence. And until our understanding of citizenship includes more responsibility than privilege, we're going to be in the continued deep trouble that we seem to be.
What does dying well mean to people who aren't familiar with the depth around which I'm included in this category, definitely the depth of which you speak about and teach about? What do people think dying well means, and what does it mean?
I think the general take on these, and we have to generalize to answer a question like this, right? So we understand there's lots of individual exceptions, and God bless them. But for those who are not exceptional, what I'm about to say probably still holds. People would generally, when asked, they would say long life, quick death. That's the magic formula. If not long, you could substitute long for good or interesting or fulfilled, but generally speaking, I've never heard anybody say, I'm looking forward to a short and fulfilled life. Something about the length that's part of its value, let's say. But the quick death part, how do you get that? Well, the question, it rotates around another question, which is, so when do you begin to die? And when you ask people this question in my corner of the world, you get the most routinized answer you can possibly imagine, the least considered answer. It sounds like small b Buddhism to the untrained ear, and it's this: you begin to die the moment that you're born. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. So then all those infants in the cradles, they're all dying people. Well, I mean, do you understand? No, this is exactly what you said, and it is clearly what you mean. You think we're basically a wind-up doll that's unwinding from the moment of birth, if not from conception. And eventually we unwind, some sooner, some later, but all of us, quote, fail. That's the general demeanor. So if this is true, and I'm not agreeing that it is, but certainly the characterization is true, what you have is a circumstance where people are alert, allegedly, to the fact of their dying for a long time, conceivably. Translation, they began to die some considerable time ago. And because of that, because of this nascent awareness that never really hatches, but seems to haunt nonetheless, the notion of a short death is no longer available. You follow? Because dying is a matter of awareness, not a matter of physical condition. Alertness to dying is a question of awareness and consciousness. It's not a question of diagnosis. Yeah. So in that circumstance, then, with the option of a quick death no longer available to you, you do something about the awareness instead of the onset. And if you can fool around with the awareness so deeply that people are no longer alert to the fatal aspect of where they are in their lives, you have people magically rescued, apparently, from the death phobia that I wrote about so much in that book. Excuse me a second. The consequence of that, of course, is that, man, you need a lot of drugs on board, legal or otherwise, prescription or otherwise, to get you beyond the awareness. You see? And so it's no surprise that people of my age who are now dying are opting for psilocybin and mescaline and LSD, and it's back, as they say in the movies. And it's not surprising to me at all that the various bypass strategies for the dilemma of awareness, of the awareness of fatality, is so heavily relied upon that people would prefer out of mind rather than alert to the circumstances at hand, to be out of mind. It used to be sedation. It still is, in large measure, sedation. And I'm persuaded that the opt-out alternative drug regimes, or plant medicine regimes, if you insist, these things are kind of a methadone approach to basically the same dilemma, which is awareness that you are dying is in and of itself suffering-inducing. And therefore, the best way to contend with the suffering is to mess with your capacity to be alert to what's actually oncoming. What it does, of course, is disable you entirely to be a three-dimensional human being in real time as you begin to die. It challenges you to forsake the alertness for the sake of a more hoped for end, let's say, a kind of end. You know, the famous comedian's line, I don't mind dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens. Well, that's absolutely available. It's available. And so, sadly but truly, the statement that you read is probably truer now than it was when I wrote it 9 years ago.
Already, I can't wait to go back and listen to the last few minutes of what you've said over and over, so I can actually take in and let my mind go down all the and really hear it. This is one of those conversations that I will hear so differently later when I'm able to listen back again and again, and then I'm going to wish I had asked 1,000 different questions when I do that. I always do. Sure. You remind me of, or I was thinking of a guest I had on, Rob Marshall. He's an Australian guy and had been through a whole bunch of really hard things that we talked about. But one of those things was he survived a widowmaker heart attack. And a widowmaker, not many people, obviously, hence the name, not many people survive that. But in the process, and he's one of two people that I've had on the show that have this same experience, he died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital for, I think, 16, 17 minutes. And I asked him, what did that, do you have an awareness? Did you have an experience? Do you have a memory of what that felt like? And he said, I have absolutely, with complete clarity. He goes, I felt, so he has this feeling that he had, knowing that he had passed. And what's on the other side of that is he said, I am no longer scared of death. And so now he can truly live and live with purpose. But it in the way that he talks about that, I can't even reenact it. Like, it was just this really profound realization and the removal of, I don't know, preoccupation and fear and maybe the unwillingness to accept that that's going to happen. He said, obviously, I don't want to die, but I'm no longer scared of it. In fact, I look forward to embracing it when it does happen.
Yeah. Well, it's in a dramatic story, obviously. And here's the thing. The Black Widow option is not available to most of us.
Thank goodness.
Right? Okay, so given that, let's call it the ordinariness of our demise is the more likely scenario for the lion's share of us. Because of that, the reason I'm pointing this out is not to be argumentative. It's to suggest a very germane issue. If you don't have a spectacle to rely upon to obviate your fear of death, as this man appears to have done, then you don't get to not be afraid. Then you realize it's a much subtler business than afraid, not afraid. The business has to do with, are you able to make friends with your fear? Are you able to befriend it without detoxifying it, without fooling it into being less serious than it actually is? It's absolutely serious, no matter what your opinion and your feelings on the matter are, right? Mm-hmm. And as far as we can tell, it's a big friggin' deal. That would appear to be, an understatement. And as far as we can tell, although I'm inclined to imagine that there's more after, but that doesn't, I think, diminish for a second the utter finality that death visits upon you, not just at the moment of death, but all those anticipated moments where you look, this is the best example I can give you. I have a beautiful cup here made by a friend of mine in Mexico. This thing will last longer than me. How to make peace with that? You might think, well, I want the world to last. Yeah, but a cup can outlast me. How's that even conceivable? And the answer is, oh, you have to conceive it. You have to go around and make peace with all the things that will outdo you, that will proceed without you. Not just people, but circumstances and wishes and barns you relocated from across the river, everything in between. None of these things are on the same, how should I put it, exit formula that you're in. And so I don't think it's a matter of not being afraid. It's a matter of a bit of a constant arm wrestling match with that fear, not in order to win, but in order to, well, I can't think of a better reiteration on this matter than the poet Rilke, who towards the end of his life apparently wrote something in the order of this: human beings are not here to prevail or to be successful or to win. We're here to be defeated by greater and greater things, which is a beautiful understanding that if you're going to be defeated, and there's no if, you are, then at least you have something to say about what undoes you. And that's a marvel when you think about it. And it's not trickery. It's not sleight of hand. It's, you can hold out in some respects. You can educate yourself in such a way that the indignities of the bathroom as they visit you towards the end of your life are not really the bigger deal that you might have settled for once upon a time. See what I'm saying?
Your words are so powerful, Stephen. Like even just that sentence, I feel it within myself, and I'm surely I couldn't be the only one that can hear that and realize and already feel a shift in resilience or attitude or perspective and perception of the world and what we think and what, like, just the idea, the empowerment of accepting, right? So one of my biggest questions recently or kind of thought rabbit holes I go down is, how do we accept what we need to accept, but still be empowered to, accept it without sitting down, accept what we can't change, but still have the drive to change what we can change. I don't even know if I'm making perfect sense with that, but
yeah, I'm following you. Yeah,
the way that you described that to me really was almost the answer. Like, that's how. And it's only a slight shift in perception.
That's very true. That last thing you said in particular is a marvel, isn't it? That we're not talking about a shift of some kind of 180-degree psychic realization that impoverishes completely the life you've lived up until now and completely empowers you to prevail thereafter. That's, excuse the language, but that's bullshit in the extreme, no? But I should say, too, that I'm not talking about acceptance in any way, shape, or form. So I would prefer to imagine it this way. There are things that are bigger than you. Most of your life is bigger than you. Your death in particular is bigger than you. And from that point of view, it's not really your death at all. It's kind of entrusted to you in a way that's not dissimilar to your life. You really can't lay claim to it as if it's something that's a possession of yours. It slips through your fingers, and there's not much of a possession there. But you could imagine it as a kind of trust that the world somehow entrusts you with this little spark of life that animates you for 20 or 80 or years or whatever in between it might be. And, you're not an exemplary citizen all the time. Well, I'm not. I should just leave it at that. And so that's really not the measure, is it? The measure is, did you grow so accustomed to being alive that eventually it became no big deal? Because if you did, the tragedy of that, the heartbreak of it, is going to overwhelm you sooner rather than later, no? And that's what your dying becomes. is an exercise in grotesque elements of regret. So I'm prescribing here something that hurts at the time. The realizations that we're discussing here now, they absolutely hurt upon first contact and second and 10th contact. But you grow a degree of skillfulness in engagement, in the rules of engagement when it comes to mortality. Yeah. And then you realize it's not really for you to, quote, accept. It's bigger than your acceptance, you see. And it doesn't proceed by the rules that you imagine life is bound to. It's really not the case. Most of the great religious and non-religious traditions of the world, the wisdom traditions call them, it seems to me that most of them bend over at exactly this point in the saga and do their best to help their adherents understand that being ready for death doesn't mean death ceases to be a big deal. It's like trying to get ready for the one, not a great imagining here. You're trying to imagine yourself, to ready yourself for the person you're supposed to be with, who you haven't met yet, right? Is it like that? Well, the idea is that you'll recognize them when you see them, or that there'll be no big deal when you finally meet them because, quote, you're ready to meet them. Death is a very similar thing. No, it's a big deal, and readiness is it's not a booster shot. It's not an inoculation. Readiness, when it comes to dying, puts you in death's road. It doesn't exempt you from anything. So that's why I leave aside the notion of acceptance and propose it has much more to do with learning than it does with resignation.
I'm so grateful for this conversation right now, and I want to tell you why. Because in 2020, and I've got a stack of stories in my life like this, but 2020 was a big one, and I've talked about it a lot. Obviously, everyone had a 2020 experience because the pandemic came from nowhere. Yeah. And in that, I was faced with everything in my life, in my business life, and everything. I was faced with the uncertainty and potential, in inverted commas, demise of everything I was working for in that material world. But before going into a particular business, I'd ask myself, if this doesn't go the way obviously I'd like it to, will I change enough or learn enough through the experience to warrant a financial demise? And my answer to that question was yes. So when COVID and the pandemic came and that was laid out in front of me, I didn't waste any time worrying about it. I was like, okay, you've answered this question. So let's just call this the worst thing that's going to happen. Let's just say this is here, make amends with it, and do what you're going to do anyway. And what I found really interesting is under circumstances like that, I thrive really well, and I have a great energy and positivity and outlook, and I do great things. But when that looming thing, and I want to build this relationship with death through what you've said now, because that's like the big looming thing that doesn't need to just come from nowhere and frighten us. But I want to think and create and live and behave the way I felt in that moment all of the time. But when that thing kind of parks itself, normality sets back in and it's removed, and then it's back to the monotony. And with monotony comes the thinking and worrying about crap that doesn't matter, that doesn't even, and there's an inaction to it, and I'm not creating great things, or as great as I have the potential to create.
Yeah. In other words, you would hope, I think, along with me, that there's something so utter, it's a great adjective, so utter about dying, that it would leave you categorically altered once you glimpse it for real. And the alteration, you would imagine, would be freaking permanent. Like you couldn't possibly set it aside for the sake of some banal pursuit of or other. Lo and behold, your intuition is absolutely correct. That no matter how mammoth the event is, even your man who was on there with his Black Widow scenario, the chances are very good that there's a degree of despair awaiting him when the claim that that experience made upon him fades in some fashion or becomes less spectacular, or the effort to try to translate it into an ordinary life that's not peak experience after peak experience.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of a very ordinary, non-colossal attempt to make sense incrementally of what he saw for what constitutes ordinariness. Because ordinariness is not a curse. Ordinariness is the deal, and the spectacle is the exception. Oftentimes it would appear in the kind of inspirational literatures that for most people an encounter with the vast, let's just call it this, is so momentary that it can't even be measured chronologically. It's so brief. But for all of that, its intensity is unspeakable. And you realize, well, of course, this arrangement is very merciful, because if it's that unspeakable, then longer than a microsecond would be totally undoing. And so we seem to be in good hands very, very briefly, and then left to our own devices thereafter. And some people don't survive any kind of attempt they make at reentry. And their ordinary life suffers horribly as a consequence of this exposure, you know? This is an amazing sequence of thoughts to entertain, that there's no guarantee about insight, neither guarantee as to outcome or permanence or availability to you. And then I would say I don't say this ironically at all, if you're lucky, you re-enter the ordinariness of a ill-considered life, occasionally interrupted by a memory that you don't seek, that you did glimpse something else, and the something else seems to have merit, even if it doesn't have fixity. And that's not a bad realization to come to.
When I did go to Vietnam, there was this sense, and I was like, something's shifted, and I don't know what. And I came home and I felt there was a shift, and I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't even identify it. I didn't know what it was. There wasn't a thing I'd seen or a thought I'd had or a decision I'd made. I just had this shift and this something. And what was really funny is one of my friends that I work quite closely with, we'd chatted for 2 minutes on the phone. We'd chatted for 2 minutes at the beginning of I produce his podcast, 2 minutes before he had a guest on. And after that, when the guest left, he said, and this was maybe a week after I'd gotten back, he said, you're different. Your energy feels different. Do you feel different? And I thought that was weird because I hadn't said anything. We hadn't discussed anything. And I sat on it for another week or so, wanting to do a podcast to talk about what I make of it. And by the time I did my own podcast on it, it was a rambling little podcast where I still hadn't figured it out. And it's like, that's perplexing to me to go, something happened and it was deep and almost spiritual or energetic or something, and I can't figure it out. So I'm at a loss in how to utilize it or what direction to take it or where it even came from and what it means.
Understandably so. The suggestion I'd make to you is utilize would be the least of the options available to you, the least in terms of merit or real desirable consequence. these things don't come to you so you can use them. And you may not have meant it as to be as utilitarian as I'm making it sound, but I think you did. I think that was in there. I would deeply encourage you to imagine an alteration of this kind, a dissolution of this kind, as being a kind of living thing unto itself that's entrusted to you, like a foundling at the door, right? And that you come to it with this kind of abject humility, that it's so small that it's bigger than you. Mm-hmm. And your life simply can't be what it was, but the alteration remains yours to translate. And if we could be this way with a moment, with a glimpse, we might be able to be this way with a backyard or some portion of a park that we hold particularly dear, or a poet or a singer that you've admired from a distance occasionally, and realize suddenly that if you want that poet or singer to be there, this time next year, they might need something from you that's more than admiration at a great distance. These notions, in other words, if you become a raving animist, many a thing is possible that wasn't there with your rational upbringing made available to you at the time. And I think, well, I'll tell you a little brief vignette that comes. I was lucky enough to travel briefly in Mali, in West Africa, and I found a pamphlet that came from the government. And part of the information in the pamphlet was the breakdown of religious affiliation as a percentage of the general population of the country. And it said, get a load of the categories. It said Muslim 90, let's say 2 or 3%, I forget exactly the numbers, and Christian 3 or 4%, which leaves. And then it said animist, other, or the rest, or something like this. And I thought, wow, Muslim, Christian, animist. Most Western people would never put those things in the same sentence or imagine them as constituent parts of a commonly held something. And I think there's a reason for that, because monotheism tends to be ongoingly at war with animism. Historically, all of the missionizing, all the colonizing in your country and in mine, all of these things are traceable in part to the maniacal insistence that the one God religion prevails over the many God religion, and the attempt to, prove that out or enforce it or whatever it is. And the amazing thing is, the many God religion doesn't have the same problem with the one God religion. Nothing close to it. They simply find a way to say, wow, this one God that you have, our many gods never included that guy who think he's the only one. What a marvel. Now our pantheon is complete because our gods now include this poor guy in the corner who thinks he's the only one. Anyway, you can tell I'm recommending animism as if nothing else, a last-ditch effort to be okay.
Where did your curiosity begin, and when, which led you to, I guess, looking at and speaking about all of this from the standpoint of death and dying? What was do you recall the first, I guess, spark of curiosity that took your attention and led you here?
I think it was two things, which I can't lay claim to or authority over either one. The first one was when I was very young, and I was in the hospital dying of spinal meningitis, which in those days, I'm talking about the mid-1950s, that was fairly fatal for somebody of my age. I was 3, I think, at the time. And so I was dying. And it's a very clear sequence of memories, not like the Black Widow Man, probably different order, because my memories are basically of how people around me were behaving with me.
Wow.
And I distinctly remember a change in tone, the way the nurses touched me when they were fighting to keep me alive. And when at some team meeting, it had obviously been decided that I was unlikely to survive, and they touched me differently thereafter. That's an absolutely enduring memory. And I don't say it with any rancor at all. I completely understand and abide by the adjustment they made to be able to survive the death of a young, child on their watch, because that's nobody goes to medical school or nursing college to preside over that kind of event, clearly. So I remember that distinctly, and it abides even till the present moment. And then, I didn't know there was such a thing as what I call the death trade. I honestly didn't know. And so suddenly I was in it. So I didn't seek it at all. And the circumstances are just biographical, not that interesting. But the gist of it is I was introduced to something I didn't know existed. And the marvel or the miracle, no, that's too strong. The mystery of the thing was that I kind of knew what to do right away. No prior experience, no mentor. I'd been mentored previous to this in a really indirect fashion, being an apprentice to a storyteller in the United States off and on for 6 or 7 years. And somehow there was a translatability between that infant experience, this time with this man I've just mentioned to you, and the circumstance I find myself in, where people are doing everything they can during their dying time not to die. That's like desperately trying not to be pregnant while you are. It's a kid. It's very similar, I think. And so those things somehow, whether they were all leading to a certain place, I can't say. But I was lucky enough that they coalesced at a certain time, and I wasn't in my 20s and I wasn't in my 30s. I think that helped tremendously too, because I wasn't by this time groping about for an identity or feeling lost and insubstantial, because I hadn't, quote, done anything yet. That wasn't true. I had. But this came along, and it wasn't like another interesting job opportunity. There was nothing interesting about it at all. It was grim. And yet its grimness seemed to be built for whatever life had entrusted me with before then. So all I did was click into place. And I'm not sure everybody around me at the time would agree with this characterization, but I know what I'm telling you, and I know what happened. And I've never really looked back in the sense of felt fundamentally adrift at any time or at odds with what I was being led in on. All I had to do was translate the gross disturbance that arose in me when I saw what was going on into something that was actionable, not just a gross, distress. And I was lucky that I had that available to me right from the beginning. And so somewhere there's curiosity in there somewhere, and there's marvel, but mostly I'm not the captain of the ship, I'm just pulling on the oars and lucky enough to resemble in some fashion the kinder things that you've been saying as we've been talking.
I was just thinking it's people like yourself are such a gift, because your ability to translate, to connect, translate, and communicate what you are, because they're all quite doing things, and they take this one level of intellect and interpersonal skills for this thing that is a being. It's like a sense and a being and an energy and a thing that doesn't, and a knowing, all of this stuff that doesn't make normal human logical sense the way that we know it. And for those two things, like to possess those two things and be able to share that with the world is quite a gift, isn't it?
You're very kind. And sometimes that does happen indeed. But other times, I have to tell you, I engage in exactly the same activity. For example, in a show that we put together here years ago called Nights of Grief and Mystery, that's bringing me to Australia pretty soon. I think in a couple, 3 weeks or something or less.
Melbourne? Are you going to be in Melbourne?
Indeed, yeah. I can't give you the date right off the top of my head. 27th, I've just been told from Central Command. 27th of October.
Sold out.
Oh, sold out though, alas.
Damn.
Yeah, but you might know somebody, I don't know.
Good
But
point.
well, yeah. What was I going to say about it all? It's because you only get so many turns, you only get so many chances, and that can either make you very desperate, or it can give you a sense of urgency that really doesn't have much desperation in it. But I have to tell you, I could do exactly the same thing as we're doing right now and have a room full of hostile, belligerent, bellicose responders. Absolutely.
Mm.
Excuse me.
What's really interesting to me that I've kind of, I guess, that I'm aware of now is this ever-present dichotomy that we are in, which is this we can understand and be and feel and do and move through life, but always then being pulled into hardwired behaviors or situations and driven by them, things that now the world we live in doesn't necessarily nurture, like connection, like belonging, all of that, like identity. So now all of those needs have quite strong pulls in how we think, feel, and behave. So if our lifestyle isn't addressing them, it's really hard to then stay focused or open to the type of thing that you're speaking about now. Because in the middle of, like, if we're completely isolated and bad stuff's happened and we're triggered emotionally by things like that, I think it can drive us. It can the drive for that can be stronger, and the ability to see it for what it is can be harder. Do you think?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. And like, this is not something I have a lot to say about, but this question of so-called artificial intelligence that's ramping up, by the minute as we speak now. The timing of it coming hard on the heels of the pandemic is no surprise to me whatsoever. Largely, I think what it's down to this: people have had, in the West, have had their fair share of, quote, isolation. And they've decided, it would appear by the numbers that are signing up for this crazy making shit, that any kind of companionship is better than what they just lived. And the more agreeable the companionship, the better. And what could be more agreeable than a custom-tuned response box in the corner of your room who says all the things you want to hear that you can't think to say yourself? My God, the sheer Brave New World Frankensteinian quality of the thing is so disarming and so degrading, and shows no sign of the warning that should properly be there.
I get so bloody mad about it because we've never been armed with so much information about what loneliness and disconnection does, about attunement, about childhood, about mental health. And so we're running so fast now in the direction of understanding and knowledge, but equally running just as fast in the opposite direction towards AI and technology and all of the things that actually exacerbate it. It's like ripping us completely in half as humans, I think.
I think 15 or 20 years from now, people who are just being born now as we speak will look upon how we were and wonder why we weren't more distressed and up in arms and in the streets about what their the tech people are perpetrating right now, then we will be. And it would be like, what were you thinking? It would be like,
yeah,
the comparison that comes most handily to mind would be, the advent of Nazi Germany. How long did it take? How many indicators did you think you needed? But you're so desperate for a kind of peace at any cost that you just thought everybody was playing by the same game. And it turned out not everybody was. And it's the same thing here. It only looks like it's a solution to personal loneliness, but it's not that at all. It's not that at all. It's clear within my lifetime, likely, certainly within yours, you simply won't be able to tell by the usual metrics and indicators if you're dealing with something that's a sentient, living thing.
yeah.
I mean, this is dystopic beyond anybody's wildest reckoning. And it's hard to get people upset about something that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. Yeah. The same way it's difficult to get the same perspectives and outcomes that are tipping point, like a near death or anything. We always have to find our rock bottom before we find the good and get the right perspective and move to a better place. It's like, I wish we didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But even
There's
as
a
a
moment-
human, I mightn't be. Yeah, I still do it to a degree, not to a huge degree because I'm aware. But considering I'm aware, I do it to a massive degree, and that's a frustration.
Yeah. There's a moment in the Grief and Mystery show where I say something in the order of, be prepared to stop. That's what the sign said. Didn't happen though. Sign's going to change. Be prepared to be stopped. We haven't got it right. And that's what made the world of young people. We're their fate. That's how it seems. So I'm commiserating with you. It's exceedingly difficult to be both concerned and alive. Oftentimes you feel you have to choose between these things. You don't really, but man, you need some kind of bona fide human example of what it means to engage both of those things at the same time. That's what animism is, as far as I can tell, is a capacity to be utterly engaged with the troubles of the times and utterly alive as a consequence of that. And if we're going to contend in any reasonable way with what these computer manufacturers are fomenting, we're going to need both of those skills in spades without demonizing the people behind the machinery. But the machinery itself does a pretty good job of imitating all things demonic, as far as I can tell.
I could talk to you for, I reckon, a week straight, Stephen. I just want to go and lie down and process this all now and think about it. I just want to spend the whole day contemplating. I honestly cannot thank you enough. This has been a big and brilliant conversation for me. Where can we check you out online? Is there anything you'd like to plug? Where can we buy your books?
Yeah, all this is all the same place. Like, who doesn't have a website? So yours truly has one as well, and it's orphanwisdom.com, just like it sounds, all one word. And all of the indicators about the tour, it's coming up in Australia and Tasmania. Alas, not New Zealand this time for reasons I don't quite know, but we'll be plenty busy with the live show and with a few lectures and sort of workshop-y things that they've got me doing while I'm down there. Through the middle of this month through the middle of November is basically when it all happens. So that you can find it under the tour listing, I think, there. And then all the books and so on are available via the website as well.
You're ace. I'm from Tassie, and I was born in Tassie. Have you been to Tassie before?
I have.
Lovely corner of the world.
just Hobart, but I'm looking forward to the fish dinner that I had the first time.
Oh, yeah, great food down there. Great food, great humans. You are a great human. Thank you so much again, Stephen Jenkinson, and everybody. Go check him out. Go grab the book, and I hope that everyone loved this conversation as much as me.
Amen. And P.S. I've done a lot of interviews, as you might guess. I mean, too many. And I don't say this idly. I don't say it casually. You are remarkably well-spoken, and it shows up in what you do. And as one wordsmith to another, I very much appreciate being on the receiving end of your capacity in that regard. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.